from a federal source, these are the states who responded in this survey that said, yes, we in fact, and a little over half said, yes, they do, that they've got a state pool of cost share funding. Now, what I haven't given you with showing you these three maps is the data for how much each state presents, and we do have that as part of that survey. If you're interested in that type of information, you can go to our website, and the site will be up later, but I'll tell you now, it's www.nascanet.org. And if you go to our website, if you will navigate to the archived announcements, you'll find that 2013 survey there. You can pull that report up, and all of that data will be there for you. And it's a lengthy survey, a lot of data there, but you'll be able to pull out whatever you need. So Ray, I just wanted to give kind of an overall picture of, and a 30,000-foot view of funding in the country as far as the relationship between districts, state associations, and state agencies. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, and we can turn this over to our speakers.
Thanks, Mike. Just an excellent summary for us today, and I found that survey to be extremely useful, especially if I wanted to fine-tune my search for information on different topics. It really helped me narrow down who I would give a contact to. And one thing NASCA has taken pride in over the years, Mike, has been that great sharing back and forth with one another about what we have and what we want to have, and helping each other get there. We've shared a lot of techniques and ideas over the years.
You're exactly right, Ray. That's the strength of this organization, is the information sharing.
Yeah. So some logistics. Thanks so much, Mike, for those opening comments and survey review. Logistics for today. All the lines will be muted except for our presenters today. That will keep the noise down, the dogs barking in the background, or someone coming into your office to enlighten you on something for us all to hear. That's never really good for a webinar, so we'll mute all the lines. Our questions are going to be on the web, so go to the questions part of your dashboard on your GoToWebinar dashboard there, go to questions and type in your question. We're going to get to as many of those questions as we can for the presenters. Our presentation is being recorded as we speak. That was my reminder, as Mike did, to record this so we can put it up on the webinar, up on the website. I put the webinar up on the website so that you can go to it at a later date if you wanted to share it with more of your staff. Feedback is always welcome. Certainly we love to hear about, if you thought the webinar was great, we love to hear that, but also if you've got comments, recommendations, and et cetera, get those to Mike Brown at the email address shown on the screen there. That's still the right address, isn't it, Mike?
It certainly is, Ray.
Okay, just checking. All right. So our purpose and description for today's webinar is presentations from conservation leaders across the nation to showcase how various states fund their conservation programs in conservation district operations, including the source of funding, the amount, and what led to getting to their current state funding level and methodology. So our agenda for today, there'll be 2 rounds of speakers. We're going to start today with Joe from Michigan and Louise from Maryland, John from Minnesota, and then we're going to stop and take some questions for those 3 speakers and those 3 presenters. And then we're going to move on to presentations from Dorothy from Ohio, Lisa from Oklahoma, and Ray from Washington State. Again, we'll do some questions and responses, and we'll close right at noon Eastern time, and we'll hit that as close as we can. So folks, without much further ado, it's my pleasure to cue up the microphone and turn this program over to Joe for his 10-minute presentation on the Michigan Agriculture Environmental Assurance Program and Freshwater Protection Fund and Fertilizer Fees. Joe, are you on the line?
Yes, I am, Ray. Thank you. Good morning to everybody.
Joe, take it away.
Looking forward to sharing a little bit about the MEAP program and how the MEAP program is funded in the state of Michigan. The program itself has actually been around for we're going into our 15th year. It evolved, which I'll get to shortly, from what used to be the Michigan Groundwater Stewardship Program, which started, if you want to go ahead and flip that, Ray, started back in 1993. We initially had in the state of Michigan what was called the Groundwater Protection Fund. And at that point in time, industry and agribusiness in the state wanted a way to make sure with the use of agrochemicals that we were protecting wells. And so they petitioned our legislature to pass a law to allow them to assess a registration fee on pesticides and on fertilizers to provide funding for that program. And that program initially started out doing things like well closures, helping farm producers get things like different new nozzles for their sprayers or foam markers, things like that, to eliminate overlaps, eliminate excess pesticides in the environment. In the late 90s, though, we had a lot of issues and concerns in the state. Our livestock industry in particular was under a lot of pressure from some environmental groups, and so producers came together and farm leaders, farm bureaus, some of the commodity groups, and asked for a program, a voluntary program, to help make sure that they were meeting all applicable state and federal laws, as well as Michigan's right to farm law and the generally accepted agricultural management practices that go with that. And so the MEAP program was born at that point in time, and over the first couple of years, the Michigan Groundwater Stewardship Program eventually rolled into and became part of the MEAP program. The program's actually funded our total appropriations about $8.1 million, and $5.1 million of that comes from our Freshwater Protection Fund and our fertilizer fees, and I'll talk about them a little bit later, in the next couple slides. We also, through federal grants, get about $1.7 million. And I'll talk briefly in a minute about what that funds. And then our general fund, our state budget, we get about $1.3 million from that. Out of that $8.1 million, we support 5 what we call MEAP verifiers. Those are Department of Agriculture employees that are out in the field, actually on farms, verifying that they meet the standards of the MEAP program to allow them to be verified. We also have 2 engineers within the Department of Agriculture. Their job is they have lots of special projects, but they provide the MEAP program support from an engineering perspective as far as looking at engineering documentation on farms to, again, make sure it meets our standards and will be verifiable. That money funds 5 regional coordinators, which most of you out there probably know Steve Shine. These would be Steve Shine's employees. They work with our conservation districts around the state. They are kind of the face-to-face between the department and the districts on a regular basis, but they help oversee the grants that we run through the conservation districts in the state of Michigan, including these 49 local conservation technicians and engineers, which are also funded by those programmatic dollars. Those regional coordinators oversee the grants that we have through the conservation districts to put those 49 local conservation technicians and engineers in place. And then we give some grants to counties for things like clean sweep, as well as doing outreach and education. As far as the program's concerned, about 80% of that 5.1 million, well, of the 8.1 million really that you saw, but in reality the 5.1 million comes from fees on pesticides. About 20% comes from fees on nitrogen-based fertilizers, and then that 1.7 million in federal dollars that I talked about covers 15 FTEs. We have Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We have some EPA grants as well as some grants through NRCS to provide technical assistance, helping them out in their offices. So we get those federal dollars to fund those folks. The way our funding process works in the state of Michigan, under the current law, which expires, it actually sunsets at the end of this year, 12/31/15, there is a registration fee on what are basically non-specialty products, pesticides. Those are all ag-based products, and currently it's $150 for the registration plus 0.75 or 0.75% of the sales over $20,000 for that product. So something like glyphosate generates, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 a year through Monsanto for under the current fees. Specialty products, which are things not used in ag, more like what you'd find in household pesticides, disinfectant rags, those little, that come in the tubs, things like that. They're assigned a flat fee of $100. So with that said, about 3,000 ag products, 12,000 specialty products for roughly 15,000 total in the state of Michigan. So the total revenue, because of the way this is structured, is about 75% agriculture, 25% non-ag funding things within the program. We just went through our funding battle, and I will call it a battle because it was a 6-month process that finally ended as our governor signed our new bill into law a couple weeks ago. This new one will sunset in 12/31 of 21. We got it through with a tremendous amount of help from our partners. We had over 40 of our partners, the meat partners, sign on that they supported this bill. But it changed things in a pretty dramatic way for us. First of all, there will be no sales-based revenue from pesticides. All pesticides, both ag and specialty, will be assessed a $270 flat fee, and that will generate roughly the same $4 million that was generated before under the old structure. The revenues, it's going to be neutral relative, so we're not gaining or losing as far as pesticide registration. Our big concern within the state, especially within the Department of Ag here, is this switches to funding now. The majority of the funding will be for the specialty products, and only about 3/4 and about 25% for ag. And we have continuously through the last 15 years bragged about meat being a program paid for by agricultural producers, and now it's not going to be. And that's a concern as we move forward for us. Under our current fertilizer fee structure that I mentioned in the first slide, about 20% of our revenue is generated there. Under the current system, we charge $0.015 per percent of nitrogen in fertilizer per ton. So something like urea at 46% would generate about 69 cents per ton. And that was the only ones that were charged the fee, was anything with nitrogen. We did change things this year to a $1 flat fee on all fertilizers, not just nitrogen. So that'll be phosphorus-based fertilizers as well. As everybody out there, I'm sure, is aware, we have an issue in Western Lake Erie Basin concerning dissolved reactive phosphorus, and we felt that the water quality issues weren't just a nitrogen issue, which is what the groundwater program was founded on now, but also pretty much concerned with anything involving phosphorus from a surface water perspective. So it will be a $1 flat fee on all fertilizers. That will increase revenue about $700,000 annually, which our director could use to target. Our MEEP Advisory Council can advise her on where they'd like to see that money spent, but the director will still be able to make the final decision on where that money goes. So as you can see here in this pie chart, between our state funding and our federal technical funding that we get, that $8.1 million, we use that to leverage about 16.3 more for federal cost share for things going on via EQIP, RCPP, some initiatives like that we've got going in the state. So we took those state funding and the federal stuff that we already had and basically leveraged it about 2.8 to 1 to allow our MEEP technicians out in the fields within the conservation district to channel producers through these programs to get them cost share, get them funding for projects to improve water quality throughout the state. And that, Ray, I think pretty much wraps up what I had.
Joe, thanks so much, and you're just a minute ahead of time. Let me check the questions area. Looks like we're lagging behind on our questions, but please do send along your questions not only to Joe but all of our speakers. And just to say that, we've got one in, so let me give this one question to you, Joe, then we'll move to the next speaker. And it's a general question, so I'm going to hold it to the end. So Joe, thanks so much, and we're going to give this question to all the speakers once our panel has finished our first round. So
Thanks,
it's my pleasure to, you bet, it's my pleasure to introduce Louise from Maryland, Louise Lawrence from Maryland, who's going to speak with us about Maryland's conservation funding system. Maryland, Louise, are you on the line?
I am.
Louise, take it away.
Okay, so I thought I would delve into the history to put in context what are, how we have ramped up, I guess, funding and programs over time. And since I've been here for many years, I could go back pretty far and dig through the musty records and get all this information. And so it's been very useful for myself as well as presenting the information in some sort of coherent manner. So next slide, please, Ray.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I think these are the points that I've picked a few points in time to compare what was going on in the world around us and how we addressed it and how we often came out on top in terms of getting funding. And so I guess what I would convey it as is sort of our recipe that we've used over the years. And it's, you have to sort of be aware of what the political landscape looks like around you. You might have heard that we have this large body of water called the Chesapeake Bay, and with the funding we get, we also get a lot of pressure from a lot of different groups to do things and do more. And so by doing a bit of advanced, could you go back again?
Sure.
By doing a bit of advanced planning to anticipate what the next pressure point is, we've had some success in having some desired outcomes. We try to make lemonade out of lemons, so to speak. We often get a lot of lemons. And one of the methods we've used is to keep open communications with our legislative community and to provide them a lot of information, because if you pay attention to news media, sometimes it slants things in a direction that is beyond any kind of control that you can make. So we have sort of a first-hand relationship as we can with the legislators. And we've, our districts and our agency has been willing to step up. Sometimes people have been a little bit uncomfortable with their new roles, but we have stepped up to do it because at the end of the day, we'd rather be in some control of what the next steps are and what's happening with our community than have somebody else be in charge of our fate, so to speak. And so the outside drivers pretty much have been both public interest, pressure from the environmental community, but we also get quite a lot of support from some of those same folks, and pressure to regulate the agriculture community more. So I have a few examples of some points in time. So going way back, before the Bay program began, in 1981, the State Committee in Maryland did a workload analysis to look at how many staff we really needed to address ag non-points for us. We had just a handful at that point that the state supported and that districts were able to afford themselves. And we also did a study on which watersheds in Maryland had the biggest impact on water quality of the Bay, specifically because that seemed to be the interest. And so we were pretty much positioned in '84 when the different jurisdictions leadership got together to talk about what they should do to improve the quality of the Bay, to jump in and say, you know, we need to have a Chesapeake Bay initiative specific to agriculture. And that initiative gave state money to districts for staff and operating, and we could show with our workload analysis what we needed, and it initiated an agricultural water quality cost share program, which we've had since 1984. Next slide. So we were making progress, and but not fast enough for the political winds. And as they evaluated how water quality was improving, the politicians and some of the science community said we really needed to focus on a watershed basis. We couldn't just do a statewide program, hit or miss, even though we did focus somewhat on some of our priority watersheds for agriculture. So in 1994, they switched the focus of the program to a watershed basis. And we worked with districts, and districts locally led a process that was dubbed tributary strategies. They got in all the different players in their areas associated with a watershed configuration. Sometimes it was several districts in a particular watershed. They got together with producers and extension and Farm Bureau and environmental community and went through to a process of how we could address water quality issues. And that process was pretty much adapted by all the sectors at the end of the day because it worked so well. Part of that impetus at the time was to provide more regulations. There was a distrust that the agricultural community was doing enough, and so in 98 we also had in 97 an outbreak of a water quality borne disease called diphtheria that was blamed mostly on agriculture. It was in a predominantly area where predominantly poultry was raised, and that was the focus. I think the jury is still out exactly on what the causes were, but it was definitely high nutrient levels from whatever sources. And so they passed a regulation to require nutrient management plans on all farms in Maryland. And as part of that process, as we worked through the legislative process, we saw sort of which way the direction of winds were flowing, and we decided, or the districts and the agency decided, that if we were going to have to do this, we needed to have the resources to do it well. And the districts lobbied that although they didn't do fertility management per se, there was a need to look at additional district technical and financial assistance to get BMPs in place, like manure storage and those kinds of things that enable folks to do proper nutrient management. So in 1998, we got regulations, but we also got several incentive programs, and we got additional funding for districts. Next slide. So another decade goes by, and we're getting more pressure to do more agricultural implementation of BMPs. We had a small cover crop program. It was about $1 million at the time, and we started doing surveys of the farm community who participated and didn't participate to figure out what things were most a concern for them as to their participation. And one of the biggest concerns was that they never knew from year to year how much money we were going to get, and so they didn't know when they applied how to plan for the acreage they would enroll. So that was one of the big restrictions, I guess, or burdens that they had uncertainty. And at the same time, through 2000 and about 7 years, we were still lobbying the legislature every year for the need to have continued and increased support for soil conservation districts because of the need to assist farmers in implementing BMPs. So in 2006, when the state decided that they needed a dedicated funding source to upgrade wastewater sewage treatment plants, we were able to include a carve-out in terms of this fee for cover crop program. And so our funding went from uncertain to about $6 million in 2007, which was the next fiscal year. And in that same year, the legislature felt that our story was well spoken, I guess, and they put into law that the state would provide funding for a minimum of 110 technical field positions in soil conservation districts. Next slide. And so in 2010, the Environmental Protection Agency implemented a total maximum daily load requirement on the Chesapeake Bay because we had not met our key goals to improve water quality to the extent that they could not remove it from the impaired waters list. So it became a regulatory program, and in preparation for that, in 2009, soil conservation districts went through another locally led conservation evaluation of BMP needs in the areas of their districts and looked for not only needs but what the opportunities were. Perhaps there were people who would step up and do more. And as a result, in 2010, another dedicated funding source was created by our administration at that time, and it was dedicated to non-point source issues because it was felt that we had addressed the point source issues with our previous legislation in '06. And so as part of that, this year, districts got $2.6 million for staffing, and we got another $17 million for incentive programs or cost share programs. Next slide. And so a couple ways we've done this. Every year we do an annual report about what the districts have achieved. It's glossy and pretty, and every legislature gets one. Every January. All the district supervisors, we call them supervisors in Maryland, come to town. Each district supervisor is assigned to a specific legislator. Since the rural counties don't have as many legislators, they get often paired with somebody in the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. corridor, those counties that have a lot of people. But the idea is to form a relationship with each legislator, so they know who to call, and when you show up, they know who you are, or when you call them, they know who you are. And one more slide, I think. So we do, in addition to the glossy annual report, we do one of these sheets for each district every year. And although the format is similar, each district has a unique message, I guess you could say. They talk about their accomplishments. The little charts, you can't see them too well, but on the left show what their staffing is and who their funding is, which the sources of funding are. And so when a district visits a legislator, if they visit somebody who's not in their own district, they would provide a report of what their activities are, as well as the activities of the district and the county of the person who they're visiting. And it's worked really well by matching people. So a couple last slides on. This is how our funding has changed over the last 30 years. You can see the orange bar is what we provide for technical assistance for districts. It's the financial assistance they get for staffing. And the red bar is our incentive program. So this year, pretty much, we're up to close to $30 million for incentive programs. And last slide, this is our poster child. It's the cover crop program. I don't have this year's data yet because we still got some things to do on closeout. But you can see the orange bar is how many applications we have. The y-axis is acreage in Maryland, and so we've got about over 600,000 acres that are enrolled every year. We approve a similar amount, and depending on the weather, people get planted as much as they can. This year we planted about 475,000 acres. And so that's just a brief synopsis of how we've gotten some money. We've stepped up and taken our medicine and tried to make some lemonade here.
Louise, thanks so much for your presentation. A lot of good historical backdrop and a highly successful program with steady funding sources, and we really appreciate you joining us today. Thanks, Louise. So it's my pleasure then to introduce our next speaker, and that's John from Minnesota. And John's going to speak about Minnesota's conservation funding program. John, are you on the line?
I am. Good morning, Ray and Mike. Thanks for organizing this. I've already learned some things, and I'm hopefully going to help a few other things happen with my presentation. So go ahead and let her run.
All right.
Well, here's our mission, and our agency is set up a little different, I think, than maybe some other states in the sense that we're an independent agency, and we also have oversight not only of soil and water conservation districts, but also of county water management programs, as well as watershed districts, which were another special purpose water management authority in the state that are set up with independent levy authority. So they work with soil and water conservation districts and counties. So we have that trioca of local governments that carry out our mission and our programs. But as is the case in other states, the soil and water conservation districts are fundamental to much of it. So you can go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, we have this arrangement where we have a board that is appointed by the governor, and then I'm the lead staff, of course, and we have an agency of 120 or so people that lead those local governments towards the mission, which is, conservation, clean water. We have regulatory authority over wetland protection, and now this new law that was passed in Minnesota this year on buffer protection. So those are the combination of things that we get involved with. We also have a responsibility to approve all of the local water and watershed management plans that are the basis for funding that comes from the state, from various agencies, because we work in partnership with our other agencies. That we have a natural resources department which handles the public land issues with fish and game and parks and so forth. We also have a pollution control agency, which is like our state EPA, and we have a separate Department of Agriculture and a Department of Health, which deals with wells in the case of health, in the case of agriculture, the pesticide and herbicide program. So we have several different agencies all involved in water management in Minnesota, and our mission is to work with those local authorities to carry it out with landowners, and our focus is on private lands. You can go to the next slide, please, Ray. I mentioned this a little bit already. We have a focus on the private land, and we also work very closely with federal partners, as I know other states do, and we've heard some of that already, besides the USDA partner, which is significant. We also work with the Corps of Engineers because they do not only public works projects, but they also are managing the Clean Water Act authorities for wetland protection. So we have a partnership with them on several fronts, training as well as even some joint employees. We have a long-standing tradition of leveraging federal funds, and I know other states are, of course, doing that as well, and maybe even competing with each other in a very positive way to get those dollars to our states to make the most difference, because it works the best when that federal money lands in a place where it can do some good locally, and that's what we're all about, as well as making sure that those local governments, the soil and water conservation districts, are ready to make the most of those opportunities. So we have an oversight responsibility. We do performance evaluations of those local governments on a regular basis, and they're meant to be helpful, as well as sometimes calling out things that need a little bit more attention or improvement. That goes both in the funding area, overseeing the funding that the state provides, as well as making sure the organization itself is set up to be successful, to have the right technical skills, to have the right systems in terms of IT and HR and things like that. And we're growing some of those services to local governments. And because we have those three different forms of local government, making sure they're working with each other well is a key part of our responsibilities. So Ray, why don't you go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned, our focus, as our others on this call or this webinar, focus on the private land. This is a map of Minnesota which shows where we have private land and public land. Of course, anybody who are familiar with our state know that it's very diverse, from the northeast, where we have the boundary waters and the forests and that sort of landscape, to the south and west, where we have a much more agriculturally intensive landscape, and of course the urban area, the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul. So we have various landscapes that we're managing, and those local authorities are working with landowners in those types of landscapes. And so it's not just agriculture; it also includes forests and urban areas too. So our programming has to fit the landscape and the unique resource issues that are present. So this shows, probably not too surprisingly, that the map of our impaired waters, which of course we're on a very concerted effort to identify all of them and also look at places where we have high quality and make sure we keep it before they get impaired. This just shows that the private lands are where we have our biggest water quality challenges. Next slide, please. So the budget, breaking this down a little bit, this is where the money goes, and over 90% of the money, and it seems like a lot, but of course it goes to a lot of places and there's a lot of needs, but it's to local pass-through authorities, to these counties and soil and water conservation districts and watershed districts. And so that goes to this large category of local water management, which is really about local projects, practices, and programs that are identified in these state-approved water plans. That's where those dollars go to get things on the ground through the locally led effort. We also, as I mentioned, have got some responsibility to do regulation, or we call it resource protection rules and laws. That is requiring people to do, some form of permitting. It also, means we have appeals and things like that we have to process, and sometimes they end up going to court, so we have to deal with, administrative costs in that regard. Those dollars that you see here in the sort of the upper right-hand quadrant of this chart are the dollars that the agency basically uses to carry out that work. Some of it does go to local governments, but overall, 90% of our money goes through to locals to carry out their responsibilities. Next slide, please. So in Minnesota, we have, of course, a general fund, which is the primary source, or at least it was prior to this constitutional amendment passing in 2008, which dedicated some funding from a additional sales tax percentage to 4 different areas. The general fund that we use for carrying out conservation work in Minnesota includes, of course, a portion of the agency staffing and the work that it requires done at the state level. It also has money going from state to stormwater conservation districts, both for operations and then also for cost share projects. Now, those dollars have been, static, which means they've been dwindling if you think about the aspects of inflationary increases and so forth over the last 10 or 15 years. And so this year there was a big jump in that allocation finally after many years of pursuing that. We will come back and talk about it a little bit more, but the legacy amendment, which you see here presented on the screen, was passed in 2008, started with a big initiative on the wildlife side and clean water as well. And then we also, because of the politics of making sure you had a broad enough base, added parks and trails and then the arts and culture to this too. So it passed in 2008 fairly overwhelmingly, and it has a 25-year lifespan. So it's a little bit like Missouri, if any of you are familiar with that, although they have a dedicated portion that goes to conservation work. Minnesota doesn't have a dedicated portion for that, but the clean water component as well as some of the outdoor heritage fund do definitely get to the ground through the soil and water conservation districts and other local governments. And you can see the numbers here, the percentages, the total amount, and so this has made one huge difference in Minnesota in terms of getting projects on the ground. And it is, by constitutional language, required to be supplemental to all other things that were happening prior. And so there's been, some debate here and there. There hasn't been any lawsuits yet that when the state budget, comes around every 2 years, people are asking, well, how come you're using some of this new money to do something that looks like it was being done before? And the overall state budget to all of the natural resources, environment, conservation, agriculture, all of that is now down to 0.08% of the state budget. So our general fund, is going, like most states, probably to education and health and human services and, medical costs. And so that's, 80% of the state budget. And so that's why they passed this amendment to try and get some dedicated funds for that. Here you see a graph that shows that increasing amount over the last couple of bienniums. The good news is that the state economy is doing well enough that the state coffers with this sales tax component are being increased, but we also have a greater demand for those dollars. And so you can see that the blue line is the increasing amount available. The black line is the demand for those dollars that we use through a competitive grant-making process. And so we generate a lot of demand, but we also generate a lot of disappointment because we don't have everyone getting what they're hoping to get. And so we're constantly challenged with that. Next slide. This shows just the watershed approach that we are using in Minnesota that overlays our county boundaries. And I know all of the other states are faced with the same challenge where you have longstanding governance on county lines, counties, and soil and water conservation districts, at least there in Minnesota. And then we have this watershed approach that we're using to make sure the science is being done well enough, and then figuring out how to manage that watershed when you've got multiple number of counties within it. And I know in the case of Maryland, you've got other states that you've got to work with, of course, a great deal too. Minnesota is fortunate. We have mostly at the top of the continental divide, so we don't have so much water coming from other states, but we have, within each state, of course, we've got the county boundaries to work through, and this has been one of our challenges, and the laws in Minnesota now are prescribing a 10-year transition to watershed management, so we will be embarking on that. I expect that some of the funding issues are going to come up around that as well. Next slide. You know, we do projects. I mean, a lot of them are little things on private, property. Some of them are very big things on public drainage systems, and so they're a variety of things. Those local plans prescribe what kinds of projects and practices are needed and where the science is used to generate those plans, and this is a few examples of actions being taken in the 3 local governments that I referred to earlier that Minnesota works through. Next slide. We also have an easement program, which is, of course, permanent conservation, and our laws require that wetland restorations be done through permanent easements. Our cost share program requires that they be done enduring practices, so I'm interested in hearing more about how the cover crop programs have been successful with public funding going into that. You can see here, and we've restored an awful lot of wetlands, but we've got a lot more to go. There were 10 million lost, and we've got a few 100,000 back, so we've got some work to do yet, but the season program has been very successful in getting permanent conservation with multiple benefits on the land. Next slide. I think I'll just skip through here, Ray. This is just more of some of the things that we're doing to make sure, as I described earlier, the oversight to local governments is being done well enough. We've used a lot of the science. We've done the TMDL work and actually gone beyond that to use what we also include as protection measures to make sure that high-quality waters aren't going to be degraded, and this is a number of reports that you could find if you're interested in how those works of science are being used to works of action on the ground. Next slide. A few things that are issues, coming up. We have just in this past legislative session seen finally a big investment into the soil and water conservation districts to the tune of an additional $11 million per year for their operations. That's going to be distributed in an additional $100,000 for each of the 90 soil and water conservation districts. We are trying to, work with the ag community to figure out how we can do better in some of our tillage practices, and soil health has become an issue that we know has more to do. It has clean water benefits, it has productivity benefits. It's also, an annual practice that has to be somehow managed and documented, and landowners have to, in their own business, turn their operation around a bit, and that's one of the more challenging aspects that we face. We also have some places, if you look at the lower left corner of the slide, that we have had conservation practices that were put in place 20 years ago ripped out because we've got new landowners who don't have the same ethic or the same commitment to conservation and causing harm to others, both in the water and in neighboring properties. So we had some legislation passed to help deal with these egregious cases this past year. Next slide. We've got the issue of buffers. Minnesota, our governor came out in January and acknowledged that we didn't, our existing laws we had on buffer protection, which were on the books but without very effective enforcement tools, were needing some attention, and he made it a very high priority for him and pushed the legislature and, of course, with the agency's help to get something done, and so we have a protection mechanism now in place for that. We have had a wetland protection law in the state since the early 1990s. Districts are also involved in all of these things. The state as an overseer and administrator in the local governments working with landowners to figure out how to either solve the problem they have with a wetland that is in the way, so to speak, and to mitigate it, or to restore a wetland where one can be restored, where we've lost a number of them. Next slide, please. Drainage is a huge issue, and we've invested a lot of time trying to figure out how to make those systems that are, been in the landscape for 100 and 150 years also work to hold water back in some cases, and the mechanisms to pay for that have been evolving of late. The ditch authorities or drainage authorities can collect money to get rid of water, but they have a very hard time collecting money to hold water on the land, and that's going to be one of the key aspects going forward, and local property taxes or assessments are a part of that, but we don't have those consistently working in the state. So that's one of the things I'd like to learn more about and figure out how we can generate some more local revenue to match the state and federal funding. Next slide, please. I think that's about it, Ray, for my time, and I will stand for questions and certainly enjoy hearing the answers to the questions others provide.
Outstanding, John and Louise and Joe. Thank you so much for these outstanding presentations. So let's get right to the questions, and thanks to all of the participants that are putting in questions today. The real involvement with local districts in the pass-through monies, are they implementing a state policy with the projects, or are these projects generated from local input from the ground up? And John, let's start with you. You were the last one to speak on this, and I think you touched on some of it that add to that. Yeah. Are we doing just state projects, or are these locally generated projects, or both?
That's a good question. They're locally generated projects, though, that come from a state-approved plan, and they have to have identified as the highest priority places and benefits for those projects. And so it's a competitive approach that's used for most of the money currently. We are trying to evolve towards a watershed-based approach, and if those watershed plans are going to be everything we hope they are, we envision more of a more generic state commitment to those plans, and then the locals will be entirely responsible for picking the projects and practices within that plan. Currently, it's a bit of each. The locals get to suggest their highest priority projects and practices, and as long as they're in a state-approved plan, they're eligible. But then, of course, we've got this demand that's 4 or 5 times for the amount of money we have, so we end up picking the best of the best through that process. But we believe that a more generic acceptance of these high-quality plans will lead to a future where we don't have to have such a state level of involvement.
All right, thanks. And Louise, how about Maryland? The mix between locally driven projects and state priorities, that sort of thing, on the pass-through monies.
Yeah, we have an agreement with each district that talks about performance goals, but beyond those, for example, for our cost share money, pretty much the enabling legislation just says as long as you address a water quality problem or possible potential problem that it's eligible. So if there's a local project that they want to put forward, we fund it as long as they can meet the water quality benefit. We don't do wildlife habitat. We do a little bit of wetland, but only if they can show water quality benefit from it. So far, we have not had to rank or prioritize. We have had adequate funds to meet all their needs.
Thank you.
Unusual, but
Joe,
that's the way it is.
That's fantastic news. Joe, how about in Michigan? That mix of locally driven priorities and projects versus implementing state policy.
It's going to be interesting, Ray, because under the new legislation with that extra $700,000 that's generated, one of the possibilities is to allow some locally driven projects to be funded and for us to utilize those funds in that way to improve water quality. Currently, though, everything we do via our technicians in the field and the MEET program is pretty much state, directed, state-driven, and moves down through the districts that way. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what happens over the next few years as far as the opportunity to fund some locally driven projects.
Thanks so much. And let's stay with you, Joe, just for a bit. And that is any of the MEET federal funding and the MEET funding from EPA 319?
We did have a project going on for a while. That's kind of tapered off. That actually, I think that ended here at the end of July, Ray. So now most of that funding goes to, we have a couple technicians that are funded under EPA dollars down in the Western Lake Erie Basin region on special projects, as well as our what we call conservation technical assistance innovation. It's basically CTIs. They work in districts to help NRCS with their design and engineering load. We split the money between NRCS provides half and we provide half, and we've got 13 of those folks as well. So they do the bulk of the, that's where the bulk of our federal dollars are going.
Okay, thanks so much. So the item, one question that came in was regarding will the presentations be available after the webinar, and I'll answer that actually in 3 ways we can make those presentations available. One will be on the NASCA website. Will be one way that we're going to make the whole recording actually on. We can also, I believe, Mike, if you're still on the line, we could make the presentation probably on the website too, or the presentation, the entire set.
Yeah, absolutely, Ray.
Okay, so both the recording and the presentations can be up there. And then certainly you could contact either the presenter or contact Mike or I or Aaron, and we could get you any of the presentations that you wanted. We can make that available. We could actually send those out if they're not too large. So yes, we can. The short answer is you bet. So the next question was regarding the amount of capacity for our project activities, and I believe Louise and John, you both mentioned this, that the amount of money going out to the locals and hiring local people versus hiring state employees. So Louise, let's start with you because you mentioned this, and I think you actually showed a slide on this. So Louise, the amount of capacity building at the local level versus state.
The funding we have has supported both. We have state employees, but they are located in soil conservation district offices. And when we hire them, the districts help with the recruitment and the interview, and they supervise them, but they get the state employee benefits. The new money we got in beginning in 2010 or 2011, the 2.6, those folks are district employees, but they do have a funding source from the state. So they're supported with our money, but the districts handle recruitment and hiring and supervision. And if they can get the county to pick up some benefits, they do. Some districts have benefit practices, benefit policies rather, that they are able to offer, and some just provide contractual reimbursement. So it's a bit over the board depending on what they have ability to do.
So these state employees actually are out there located in the district offices, and a mix of district folks too that are funded with these the fundings that we talked about today.
Right. Right.
But you don't have an army in your office then.
No. If you just look at the people who work with districts, we might have, I don't know, 10 or 15, well, maybe 15 or 20.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. John, how about that? The capacity built at the local level, the state employees working at the local level, or local employees only? What's it look like there in Minnesota?
Well, in Minnesota, we've used much of a locally led process, so all of the funding that the state provides to districts and actually to counties and others goes for local staff. They are employed by that local conservation district board or the county in some cases. The only thing that we've done with state level support, I mean, of course, is the oversight that our agency provides and the grant making and all of that. And we also have technical assistance that goes to districts on a shared basis. And so one of the things that's been needed and trying to be grown of late is that, you know, each county or each oil and water district doesn't necessarily have to have an engineer employed, but if they can have access to someone when they need them, you know, kind of like the old NRCS model used to be, where they would provide some of those services. We at the state are doing that through these shared services agreements, and so we have a group of, you know, 8 or 10 soil and water districts that will share access to a high-level technical person, a GIS person, or something like that. And so it's really about local staff first, and then in a case of shared services, that's where the state provides some additional support.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Now, from time to time, we know that you've got, well, let me not leave Joe out of this. Joe, how does it look in Michigan regarding that local capacity, state employees, local district employees? So.
All of our funding, Ray, goes through the conservation districts. Those people that work even on the meat program or our CTIs are hired and managed by the districts, the district manager, the district administrator, whoever that is within the conservation district. So all the capacity for the program is based at the local level. Nobody in the district offices are state employees.
Okay, thanks so much. I started to say from time to time the speakers have questions for one another. And so Joe, John, Louise, part of the fun of this is you may have a question for somebody else on our first panel here.
It's not so much a question, Ray, it's just a jealousy of John. I first heard about that legacy tax they've got, that clean water, that 0.3%, and I'm envious. I'd love to be able to generate $300 million like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can just comment on a little bit is that, that was a large political endeavor that took place at the legislature for probably 10 years before it finally did get to the point of passing. And it started out as a habitat-based proposal, and it grew from there to get enough political support. And so I don't know, if there's any advice I would have other than, it takes more than an army to pull something like that together, and the political aspects of it are going to be more important than any of the, the conservation-related things that, we're all responsible for. So I can give you more information, but it's a political issue before it becomes a practical one.
John, was that due in part, though, to the advancement, and you mentioned this on your presentation, the advancement and pulling in other power clusters from the arts and parks and places like that?
Yes, in the end it was. It started out as this just a habitat piece, and it was because people believed that the state budget was, never going to be able to do enough as it was currently structured to accommodate the environment or natural resources that always seemed to fall to the bottom. And as it wasn't too hard to see that with the 0.8% that we're currently at. I think it was at 1.1% when the amendment passed. Everything else being used in the general fund for those, critical services that the state has to provide. So that was it. I mean, the Missouri model was where Minnesota looked first, was to see how that was done, and that was pushed and pushed, in the media and so forth, and the outdoor riders, and then the clean water piece came on just at about the right time, where, the EPA directives, not quite the same as we saw in Chesapeake Bay with Maryland and other states, but, the expectations for if you want to get your communities to grow, you're going to have to take care of cleaning up your water, because we're not going to be able to issue a discharge permit. And so people started to pay attention to, our water needs some help too. And so that's a big part of it. And then the arts part was really to make sure there was enough of a political base, in some of the urban areas of Minneapolis, St. Paul to generate enough votes, because we knew it'd be more of a challenge in some of the rural areas. And that was, it wasn't my decision, of course, but that's what the political calculation was about.
I'm so glad you mentioned Missouri, and we've got Bill on the line participating today, and we have enjoyed his presentations over the years about how they built that sales tax system. And so don't forget, when you're making calls to our NASCA members, to include Missouri in that calling too. So thanks so much. Any other questions, panelist to panelist? Okay. Again, we thank you so much, Joe, Louise, John, for your presentation today, and hopefully you're going to stay on with us and listen in to the folks as they talk now, because we're about ready to switch gears to our second set of 3 presentations. And so thank you again to each of you. So without too much further ado, I want to unleash the lines here and bring Dorothy on from Ohio. Dorothy, are you with us?
I am. Thank you.
And Lisa, are you with us from Oklahoma?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. Great to have you both on. Thanks so much. And so we're going to then start with today. Our lineup is Dorothy from Ohio will be presenting. Oklahoma will be presented. Oklahoma's funding system will be presented by Lisa, and then finally Washington State by your moderator, Ray Ledgerwood. So without further ado then, Dorothy, would you tell us about your program in Ohio for state conservation funding?
Yes, my pleasure. And I just want to thank you for being invited to participate today. And just for the information, some folks, I've been on board in this role for about about 10 months. I took Fred Hammond's position. Many of you may know Fred. Fred retired last spring, and so I started last September in his role. Previous to that, I was one of the program specialists team in Northeast Ohio for about 20 plus years. So my pleasure to be here today. My presentation is going to focus on the dollars that go out to soil and water conservation districts specifically. I'm not going to talk about our state agency budget as much, but I will touch on a few things related there. So we're very proud of the history of soil and water conservation in Ohio and the locally led efforts here. This first slide kind of gives you an outline of the state match dollars that are generated and put out to districts every year. We get about $2.9 million from the general revenue fund for our soil and water district state match. The rest of those dollars come from, about $8 million come from tipping fees on construction and demolition debris, and municipal solid waste, also from a fee on scrap tires. And you can see the approximate revenues that are generated from those annually. And then just a little history on the funding in Ohio. There was a big push in the late 60s to restructure soil and water conservation in Ohio. Originally, the conservation organization on the state level was through a committee formed through Ohio State Extension in an effort by the Federation of Soil and Water Districts at that time to raise the presence of soil and water conservation. There was an effort to replace the Soil and Water Conservation Committee with a bona fide Soil and Water Commission, and if you could go back just a bit to and also created a division of soil and water districts within the Department of Natural Resources. So that was a push from organizations from the Department of Agriculture, ODNR, as well as many farm organizations. So the Senate Bill 160 was a huge turning point in conservation. And throughout the 80s, the division merged with another division called the Lands and Soils, which brought some of the what's now called GIS into the divisions, along with the soils section. So we're very comprehensive division at that time. And throughout the 80s, probably one of the biggest effort was to begin to approach the state legislature about funding match dollars to districts on a one-to-one basis, because in the revised code here in Ohio, match dollars from the state are generated by the amount of local dollars that are generated, and it has been the goal of the district since that time to get state monies that would match those local dollars on a one-to-one basis. So that is still the goal of the Federation of Soil and Water Conservation District here, is to try and achieve that goal. In the 90s, the districts continued to grow. Next slide. And it says here, in terms of authority, funding, and controlling our destiny. With the advent of office closures in the 1990s from NRCS, we had several districts who had, their office administrated and their telephones paid for and copiers supplied by NRCS. And when those office closures took place, districts had to rally themselves and you know, begin to take control of their own destiny, which for somebody that was on the front lines of that, I think was some of the, you know, best things that happened to some of those soil and water conservation districts. But it also kept the motivation up at the state level to continue to fund districts, and the Soil and Water Commission at that time also provided additional dollars to those districts that were a part of the office closures, providing them extra dollars to make capital purchases like copiers and telephone systems, and in some cases, you know, their own building space, etc. And it, you know, carried the legislature, along with that, being able to appropriate funds to about 91% state match at that time. And into the you know, the next century, we even were able to gain up to a 98% state match rate with about $8.6 million. And so we look at that as you know, a pinnacle time where districts were really humming. Staffs were increasing at the local level. Support from our division also was growing at that point in time. There was we had a large pollution abatement fund that was pulled off the top of some of those state dollars. In some cases, almost $1 million worth that went out to soil and water conservation districts for cost share programming. Of course, like in the late you know, 2000s, around 2008, we saw the local government struggling, state government struggling, and at that point in time, the conservation funding to match dollars for districts were being threatened with not a lot of general revenue fund there to fund this district programming as it was. So at that point in time, they came up with a plan to shift some of that general revenue funding over to those fee sources, the construction and demolition, municipal solid waste tipping fees, and the tire scrap fees. And as I mentioned before, it makes up about $8 million. And that's currently the way we're funded now. This next slide here, I know it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see the funding trends throughout since about 1959. We've got some big jumps. My arrows pointed to that 2008 period where we saw a significant drop there in state match funds, almost $3 million worth. We also saw some trends in you know, some slight reductions in the local government. Most of that was due to the drop in local government funds that were being sent out to counties. The state cut that dramatically, and those governments were, local governments were forced to find alternative resources. This was also a time when interest rates were plummeting, so the interest revenue on the county level was also decreasing. But I think to the credit of a lot of the soil and water districts and those local relationships, that didn't last for very long, and some of that local funding did rebound, and they found ways to continue to fund those districts. And I think that's a credit to a lot of the work, good work that's been going out there. Next slide. And I thought this was a good segue to talk about why we've been so successful over the years, and I think a lot of that has to do with the architecture of how soil and water conservation districts was formed. The longer I'm work at this job in soil and water conservation in Ohio, the more appreciation I garner for this early architecture and the relationship built in the code for soil and water conservation in Ohio. And I think that's one of the things that has sustained the finances as well as the good work that we've done. And when we talk about that, we look at, you know, this three-legged stool concept while supporting the soil and water conservation district. And we look at the three different different kind of entities that districts that support the districts. One is the member owners, working agreement, and financial and legal. And you can change the slide. Thanks. So we'll look at soil and water world here. I stole this from a presentation that we often give to our newly elected board members. And you know, with the soil and water district being at the center of the universe, I think fundamental to this financial is the partnership that's provided in the statute about the relationship between the district and those county and local municipalities and townships that generate those local dollars that then leverage the state dollars from the Soil and Water Conservation Commission. Go ahead and put the next slide up. So focusing on that a little bit more, you know, our code provides that some very definite relationships between the Soil and Water Conservation District and local entities, especially the county. While revenue from all three of those entities are matchable, it goes beyond just those. You know, counties have been given the authority to extend benefits, you know, employee benefits to districts. The auditor and treasurer have been named fiscal agents for those dollars. The county prosecutor is the legal advisor. They've even gone so far as it states that, you know, Soil and Water District employees, their vacation time is earned the same as state employees, but their sick time is earned the same as county employees. So there's definite clues that they wanted to really meld that county and state government aspect, even though, you know, in Ohio, the Soil and Water Conservation Districts are independent political subdivisions of the state. So they run their own shows, set their own guidelines per the revised code, but there's some of these nuances that have supported the relationship here. Go ahead, next slide. And part of us helping foster that relationship is the introduction of the Soil and Water Information Management System, or SWIMS, that many of you have heard before. We're actually about 10 years out with SWIMS and looking at a new iteration of that here, hopefully sometime next year. But what that does is it's a tool that gives the districts the ability to you know, inventory and track the workload, and then be able to extract that information and provide that information to their local funders. This is happens to be a slide from a district presentation given to their county commissioners about where they're spending their time and where they're spending those local dollars. And SWIMS make it very easy for districts to be able to do that. Similarly, they can show where in the county the work is being done. This is an older SWIMS report, the mapping feature that shows all the different types of workload in a particular county and where that might be located. And obviously this also helps not only from the funding aspect, but the district board members can use this information to make sure that they're providing well-rounded service. And also if they have to make staffing decisions where they may need additional help or to reallocate their human resources. We can also at the state level access some of those that information on a statewide basis and provide that to the state legislature when it's time to remind them of all the good work we're doing on a statewide basis. Next slide, thanks. So again, this is a review of where how those state match dollars are generated, and we're currently at about a $10.9 million state match level. Go ahead with the next slide.
Dorothy. Yeah.
And one last slide, I just wanted to have you take a look at, this is what our funding level looks like currently. We had about a 11.5 million appropriation. Out of that, we had 3.25 million in terms of money going for Soil and Water Conservation District. There was a earmark about $350,000 for our Senate Bill 1. This was additional authorities that the division got to implement non-point source pollution activities. The $350,000 will be going out to districts in terms of grants. We've yet to put that program together, but that'll be going mostly in Northwest Ohio to deal with the HAB problem. So we have the basic $2.9 million to go in the rest of the state. Our 5 BBO, that's our tipping fees and other fee monies pot. Historically, that's at $8 million. The Heidelberg Water Quality Lab, that's been on our budget for years, finally has its own line item and separate funding, but it always gets wrapped up into that state match. So for a total of $10.9 million to go out to districts. Now the Commission has decided over the years that they'll take some money off the top for particular projects. We see here the conservation assistance grants. You know, Ohio is quite a diverse state in terms of the landscape. We've got Appalachia that is mostly forested. A lot of that land is actually not private lands, so the tax bases there are very low, and so the actual dollars that those districts could generate locally sometimes isn't even there for the commissioners to appropriate. And then we have districts that for one reason or another may be suffering from some lower you know, funding cycles. So these conservation assistance grants, the Commission pulls out to give these districts a boost for a year or two. And so that's where this $53,800 will go. We also have non-point source education grants that go out annually. We have special dollars from Grand Lake St. Mary Project. That's where we have special focus on getting nutrient management plans and dedicated personnel to help producers there. We have funding going to watershed coordinators. We also have our pollution abatement cost share pool, $150,000. There is probably one of the lowest ones we've had in a while. So that's basically our makeup in terms of funding to districts. And I thank you.
Thanks, Dorothy. I appreciate that update from Ohio. Keep those questions coming in via the questions box. They're starting to roll in. We're looking forward to answering those questions in just a bit. My pleasure to introduce Lisa from Oklahoma to speak about Oklahoma's conservation funding system. Lisa, are you on the line?
I am, Ray. Thank you. And
You're
like
welcome.
Louise, I decided to take a historic look at the funding for the Commission and conservation districts. What I would term, it's been kind of a progression and regression of funding over time. So, but I had to go back a few more years than Louise did when the state became a state, basically. They were following the Homestead Act, and folks were plowing up ground, and within 6 to 8 years after statehood, gullies were forming and dust was blowing, and so the conservation movement here in Oklahoma was born out of the Dust Bowl. So next slide, please, Ray. When President Roosevelt sent the model law to the states in 1937 to form conservation districts, Oklahoma was one of the first ones of those to pass that law, and within 5 years 50 conservation districts were up and running. And at the same time that that law was passed, that is when the State Soil Conservation Committee was formed, similar to what Ohio was talking about, with it being mainly university and extension and those sorts of folks. But it wasn't long after, probably 3 years later, when district supervisors got in the mix and decided that that conservation committee wasn't meeting the needs of conservation districts. And so they changed the law to where it was made up. The Conservation Commission, which is what it became later known as, became the agency that oversaw conservation districts, and it was broken up into 5 geographic areas, and those were all supervisors that serve on that commission. So next slide, Ray, in the 1940s and 50s, state appropriations, what has historically happened throughout time here is that the biggest bulk and majority of the funding has gone out to conservation districts. The agency only employed two people at that time, and the rest of the money was going out to get work done on the ground, putting much needed equipment out there for erosion control measures. So what's odd with Oklahoma, though, is while conservation districts and the agency were born out of the Dust Bowl, next slide please, ironically this was also the time of terrible floods in the state. And so pursuant to directives of the 1936 Flood Control Act, the Soil Conservation Service began introducing the small watershed concept. And this consisted of a series of small watershed retiring dams to temporarily store stormwater. And that concept also required conservation practices such as grass planting, terracing ponds, grade stabilization, and waters above the dams to help reduce the runoff. So in two main laws in 44 and 54, PL 534 and PL 566, that was the start of the watershed program. And the first watershed site in the nation was built in a little bitty town called Cordell, Oklahoma. And that was one of 11 watersheds that was selected to begin this program. And then in the 50s and 566 was passed, Soil Conservation Service was the agency primarily responsible for working with sponsors like conservation districts to build flood control structures. And so the original law provided for local people to absorb half the construction cost. And nothing was happening. The sites couldn't be built because they simply couldn't come up with the funding. So the law was amended, and later that reduced the contributions to local sponsors, and NRCS or SCS at the time was authorized to pay 100% of the construction, while the local sponsor furnished easements and rights-of-way. So in that mode, the state established a revolving fund at that time to assist districts with flood control projects, and this was a huge program in Oklahoma where within 3 years after the first dam being built, 20 dams per year were being built, and by the 60s over 100 dams were built annually to get us to our current number of 2,107 structures that conservation districts are the primary sponsor, and the agency provides assistance with that. So looking at the 1966 appropriation, you can see where this was state appropriated dollars, and a big portion of it was for watershed planning, and that was actually what I would consider a reverse cooperative agreement with SCS, where we were actually paying SCS to do the watershed planning, where our funding was going to them instead of their funding coming to us. And so I didn't put a slide in there for the 70s. Most of us can't remember the 70s anyway, but it was a continuation of the 60s program. But of note, legislation changed for the agency and conservation districts in that we became the Oklahoma Conservation Commission, and districts became conservation districts as opposed to soil and water conservation districts. And the law was rewritten to include all natural resources, which was what their responsibility now included. And supervisors became known as directors. So moving into the 80s, the agency added 2 federal program responsibilities, one of which is the Abandoned Coal Mine Land Reclamation Program, and it inventories hazardous abandoned mines in 16 eastern counties in Oklahoma. And the funds are allocated through the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act that established a trust fund for reclaiming orphan coal mines. And the money for the trust is generated for a tax on active coal mining. And so we're considered a minor state in this project, and so we get a couple of $1 million a year for that program now. The Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement within Department of Interior is the agency responsible for allocating those funds. Also, with the passage of the Clean Water Act in the early 1970s, non-point source pollution wasn't considered to be a significant factor. And the attention was focused more on large industrial sources and municipal treatment plants and those sorts of things. But as a result, they weren't getting the desired output of what is considered fishable, swimmable waters. So in 1987, when the act was reauthorized, it included the new Section 319, and here in Oklahoma, that responsibility was assigned to the Conservation Commission to be the technical lead agency. And so our Water Quality Division coordinates the development of the state's Water Quality Assessment and Management Program. They manage performance-based cost share programs within priority watersheds, and they also have developed a strategy to monitor small feeder streams on a rotational basis to determine the impacts of non-point source pollution on water resources in the state. And we've been quite successful with that. Each of the little indicators there on the screen that you can see are success stories that we've been able to document through monitoring and programs being put on the ground to remove these different segments from the 303D list. So the 86 budget, just to pull a period in time, you can see where with the addition of 2 federal programs, the federal funding begins to outpace the general revenue. Another milestone that occurred in the late 80s, Conservation District employees before this time period received no retirement and had no health or dental benefits at all. So in 1989, we were able to establish an employee insurance fund, and they began paying into the state retirement system. That's been a great benefit to employees. It's also been a pretty incredible increase in cost to the agency in that we've put out over $38 million from 89 to present for those benefits. So moving into the 90s, I would call this the unfunded mandate decade, where the agency ended up with additional responsibilities without any dedicated funding source, and they still really don't have any dedicated funding source. So the commission was directed to develop a wetlands management strategy. Because we're a non-regulatory agency, I believe that's probably why we ended up with this responsibility. Because instead of regulation, the strategy was to focus on voluntary systems of private and public cooperation in managing, protecting, and restoring wetlands. And then also, we've had a long history and track record of educating youth and adults about natural resources. And so we have sponsored programs, environmental ed programs such as Project Wild, Project Learning Tree, and Project Wet. In the 90s, the state legislature chose the agency to coordinate environmental education activities among state agencies with environmental responsibilities in an attempt to not overlap and not recreate the wheel, but so that folks hopefully are working together to get a concerted message out to the public about the importance of land and water and soils and the like. And then in 1994, we also were asked to develop a strategy for developing GIS for the state of Oklahoma, and created the State GIS Council and housed the state geographer, as well as serve as the chair of that council. In 98, another big effort for conservation districts was the implementation of a locally led cost share program. This was born out of the Animal Waste and Water Quality Task Force, and they established a cost share program that we administer through conservation districts. Currently, that program is funded through a percentage of gross production tax on oil, and it is up for reauthorization this year. So that's going to be one of our major pushes to get that reauthorized. So you can see there where it's a match program where $12.7 million has been provided in assistance with an overmatch by landowners to the program. So in 98, with the increase in cost of benefits and funding to support conservation districts, the amount of money going out to conservation districts has rose to about $4.7 million. The turn of the century, the watershed program takes center stage again. Because of reduced funding, fewer NRCS employees to provide assistance, the difficulty in obtaining easements and rights-of-ways and access, there haven't been that many new dams built since the year 2000. The challenge in the 21st century for our project sponsors has been addressing the aging flood control dams. And many of the earlier constructed dams in the state were built with the design life of 50 years. And so now, in the year 2015, over half of our dams have reached that 50-year lifespan. So we've been in the process of working with NRCS in the rehabilitation program to hope that they continue to function as they were designed and hopefully remain safe. Many of our dams now, when they were built in an area that was not, there was no population, and so residential and commercial development has occurred both upstream and downstream. Land uses have changed, sediment pools have filled, and concrete and metal have corroded and deteriorated over that 50-year time span. So a lot of these dams are not meeting our state dam safety regulations, and these are why we are in great need to rehabilitate those. Next slide, please. So the operation and maintenance of flood control structures has been in the forefront. We had some massive flooding in 2007, which prompted the agency to promote the idea of floating a bond issue. We had a $25 million conservation bond passed in fiscal year 2009, and it provided much needed funding for repairs and equipment, as well as funding for match on rehab sites. The challenge now that we have is to receive the $2 million annually that we need to make the bond repayment through fiscal year 2014. Next slide, please. In 2003, the Commission entered into a contributions agreement with NRCS for assistance with delivery to Farm Bill programs. Those are monies that go out to conservation districts and help offset the rising cost of benefits for those employees and provide operating expenses to districts. And while the amount has varied from year to year, the total amount to date of funds received is about $5 million. Next slide, Ray. Fiscal years 2010 and 11 saw a huge influx of federal funding, the majority of this being from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Funds received were used for new dam construction, dam rehabilitation, numerous water quality projects, and those sorts of things. At that time, we were able to generate earnings from managing the construction projects, and that's how the agencies managed to survive numerous budget cuts in the following years, as you can see that the federal funding began to drop off. So the state funding in 2010 to present, due to downturns in the oil and gas economy, we've seen a significant impact to state general revenue, and it's resulting in a continuing budget reduction from year to year. We saw a small spike in 2015 for a one-time appropriation for watershed rehab. We've signed over $30 million worth of federal contracts for rehab with the hope of getting state match between $8 and $10 million. And the final slide we have, Ray, I can tell you that we didn't receive any of that state match this year, so we are looking to find ways to get the match money so that we don't have to send federal money back and not be able to do a lot of rehab. So the current fiscal budget reflects an additional 5% reduction in state general revenue. We continue to reduce staff to make up for that loss. Unfortunately, the amount of work still needs to continue. We currently have work groups looking at staffing in conservation districts and how we can fund those. There's challenging times ahead for conservation in Oklahoma. We look forward to hearing from all these states and seeing where the opportunities might, where we might be able to take advantage of them. I'll tell you that we have currently about 130 conservation district staff and 45 commission employees, of which only about 8 or 9 are working directly with conservation districts. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions when we get to that point.
Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate that presentation on state funding activities in Oklahoma. I'm going to cover Washington State's conservation funding briefly here. I'll set the timer on myself, and when it goes off, I'll make sure that we get right to the questions. And the questions are coming up. Please do enter your questions on the dashboard, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So in Washington State, keeping kind of a theme here of you build a state funding system over time. In the pre-70s, there was really no state funding, and mostly there were equipment and planting programs in the districts and just a few grants from the various funding sources, state, federal, and otherwise. In the 80s, water quality grants began from the old 208 water quality days, and some of us can still remember those, from the Department of Ecology. And that started an increase, more equipment, planting programs, and some other things in Washington State, and actually began a growth of our district employees, both administrative and technical. State's general funding started right in that late 1980s and 1990s, and we had a big growth in funding support for conservation districts in the administration of the Special Assessment Authority for districts, and larger grants from the Department of Ecology. And other agencies started to look at the conservation districts and their local delivery system in Washington State. And we experienced an extraordinary growth in staffing and capacity in the 1990s. In the early 2000s, we added even more state funding from general funds, began district funding, began asking the districts what their budget needs were in order to build a state budget that we took to the governor's office and the state legislature. And this saw a remarkable increase in state and federal grants, and in particular some task orders within RCS. About $1 million of task orders were authorized in a matching agreement within RCS to the State Conservation Commission, but the fundings all went to the conservation districts. In the 2010s, more growth in state funding. Operating and capital budget requests were built from projects that were entered into a database from our conservation districts. We had a legal challenge of the local assessment authority, special assessment authority, and so we looked at legislation for rates and charges legislation. So now the districts have two ways to raise fundings locally. One is through the special assessment authority that they have, and a second is through rates and charges legislation. And we had more growth in our grants and state federal agencies. So over time, we started to build a reputation for getting things done in that local conservation work. So I thought maybe you would have interest in the 2015-17 budget overview. The commission is in charge of putting the budget development process together. And we started out with a budget meeting with all of the districts in a central location in Washington State. We developed operating capital budget approaches at that meeting, and if I remember correctly, of the 45 districts, only 2 weren't represented at that meeting, where we started talking about building our operating and capital budget approaches and the procedures for allocating those funds. Operating funds included the recommendations on how to allocate the possible reductions, and our capital discussions at that 2-day meeting in Central Washington then focused on building a capital budget request based on district priorities and program needs. And so you can see some of the examples there. It's interesting, the commission state agency program needs were also talked about at that meeting and also built into our budget request. So the budgets are a whole with parts, the commission budget, the district budgets, the agency needs, the new ads. Our funding sources were mentioned by other speakers today, state, federal, and other sources. The general fund, there's a water quality account that we have here in Washington State, a Columbia River account, and a flood account. There's the federal side of the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, primarily for salmon habitat in Washington State, and then the Technical Service Providers, or TSPs. The other sources we find in Washington State, EPA, Puget Sound Partnership is PSP, non-government organization grants. So here's some rough figures for us to look at. the maintenance level this year, and you can see what was requested by the commission and districts, what the governor proposed at $13 million and change, and the final that came out of our work with the legislature this year. You'll see some kind of interesting things I'll point out here, some state toxic funds that come our way, and then also some federal appropriation authorization, which is matching dollars for RCPP or task orders for us. This VSP is short for Voluntary Stewardship Program. It's a program that's a substitute for critical areas ordinances here in Washington State. $7.6 million were appropriated for that to start that program this year. If you want more information, I can provide that, or one of the staff of our commission can supply that for us. There was a large fire called the Carlson Complex fire, and we asked for a lot of dollars, millions of dollars, for recovery efforts there to replace the fencing and some of the natural resource plantings and whatnot that needed to go on in there. And we were only partially successful at getting some funds for that. So just wanted to give you an idea of some of the other capital budget items that we work with in Washington State. The CREP program figures are here. One of the biggest things that we are working on right now, and it seems like the area that we hope to expand, would be our natural resource investments, otherwise known as conservation projects, and $4 million for shellfish-related areas and $4 million for the non-shellfish projects across the state. We also received some appropriation for natural resource investments. And here's, again, talking about matched dollars. We had a reappropriation for some federal dollars from last fiscal year and last biennium, and then we have the $5 million worth of match for our two RCPP projects here in Washington State. We have some irrigation efficiencies work that goes on project-wise, but these funds come from the Department of Ecology, through the Department of Ecology and to conservation districts. We have a fairly active easement program now that's just getting started, and you see the easement monies here at 1.6. Some rangeland preservation projects or ranchland preservation projects. Even got into an experimental work on a deep burrow drill, and then surprise in the last, this happens to us occasionally, and you across the nation, I'm sure. At the last couple of days, we received funding in the budget directed at dairy nutrient demonstration low-interest loans for dairy producers, and it was a surprise to us, and it came in the form of $5 million. One of those pleasant surprises, I suppose. Mark Clark, when he introduced this to our commission, said that he was disappointed, and with all those good pieces of information, was disappointed in some of the zeros that showed up. We had some resource-specific improvements for technical assistance that we had at $2 million, zero. Carlson Complex fire for the biennium, zero. We were looking for these funding, what was projects in an already existing database at the $8 million mark for shellfish and $8 million for non-shellfish, and ended up with half those. I guess that's good news, bad news. But for forest, rangeland health, and fire resiliency, nothing. Disaster recovery, you've probably watched this on the national news. Our flooding and our fires that we've had here in Washington State have been pretty incredible. We asked for funding for recovery and got nothing. For stormwater, got nothing. Half of the irrigation efficiency. So with that said, then, you know, it's kind of a good news, bad news scenario. We'll bring up, if I can, here through the modern technology, how this breaks out in terms of especially our implementation grants. Of our funding, about $3.8 million go to districts. Engineering grants are to support 6 engineers that work on an area basis. Our TSP grants, our technical training group is noted here. District services of different types, training and supervisor training, and some other things. We support our state association. We support our district employees association. We support the Environthon, and to the tune of $7.6 million. Wanted to make sure you saw just some rough figures there. I thought what was interesting, too, that I might present in this program today was we track leveraging that goes on from the commission fundings and district fundings coming through the commission to the total fundings of a district, and then that ratio. The yellowed conservation districts indicate those that have a special assessment authority or a rates and charges capability. And you start to see the ratio come up in those districts that have that. Sometimes 31 or 32 to 1 ratio, where districts are leveraging funds from the state to the city, to the county, and other sources. So these represent other sources of funding then. So I'll show that very quickly, and then just to give you a glance at how this relates to other sources of funding, the Department of Ecology funding amounts, and I'm just showing you a few examples. Our Recreation Conservation Organization funds some of our conservation work here in Washington State. The EPA, USDA, and Department of Agriculture non-NRCS, the Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Bonneville Power Administration. The Department of Commerce is actually working with some of our districts and some fundings, our NRCS funding, other federal sources of funding, the Forest Service, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Agency, and then other. And so we track through our normal tracking system, we can track the district total of revenues coming in and the sources of those. The savings or investments in bank, we often track, and then we track some things in terms of long-term debt. And so with that said, then that was Washington State's mini report then, and we're going to turn back to our questions. Our first question that we had was to Ohio, and so this one comes on the, Dorothy, if you're still with us,
yes.
How are the local how's that local match being generated there at the local level? Local match.
Well, at a very basic standpoint, the soil and water districts, by and large, all are a budget line within the county government funds. There's a special fund that's created in each county for district funds, and then any monies that are generated on the county level exclusively from the general fund of the county are eligible for state match dollars. So the districts submit budgets to those counties, and that's really looked at as their core. And then some of those municipal and township funds, a lot of those are generated from some of the MS4 NPDS Phase 2 work that districts are providing to local communities, and those dollars are generating state match as well.
Staying with you, Dorothy, just for a bit, there was word out that that the program is going to be transferred from DNR to the Department of Agriculture. What's the latest on that?
That is correct. As of January or July 1st, they are picking up our existence in the revised code under the Department of Natural Resources and changing it over to the Department of Agriculture. So we, effective January 1st, they're going to peel off the division of soil and water conservation, the old division of soil and water conservation that used to be a standalone agency about 5 years ago. We were merged with Division of Water, which included things like floodplain and dam safety, etc. We merged. Now they're going to peel us back off, lift that up, and move it over to a division of soil and water conservation or resources in the Department of Agriculture, effective January 1st. So we're just starting to work out how that's going to go, and we are looking forward to at this new partnership.
Okay. Second question, another question that came in is for Washington State. Do you still have your report on promises made, promises kept, or something similar? And this was like Maryland's, it was a report to the legislature of work done throughout the state of Washington. And yes, we still do have that, and if you want to email me or contact me, I'd be happy to get that information to you. In fact, we're just building our next annual report. kind of an interesting story about the promises made, promises kept. As a really friendly legislator told us, oh my gosh, you folks are doing such good work. Thank you so much. And it looks like we're funding you appropriately, which gave us pause to say, you know, what are we missing here, because we're really not being funded at the level we need. I showed you some figures to demonstrate that. And he said to us, you know, what you need to do is present the rest of the story, which is the need. So you're doing good work in this area, that area, this area, but would you please present the need for you know, additional funding or additional work to be done? So we are producing that. Happy to provide that to you. It's also available through our website. You can just Google Washington State Conservation Commission. It will take you right there. And our annual reports over the years are all posted there. Thanks for that question. We had a question come over in the chat box for all the speakers. I'm going to start with Lisa. What amount in percent in total and what form of local generated tax or fee revenue from districts tap into the operations and practices and so forth? So can't remember. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. Lisa, do you have a locally generated tax or revenue, fee revenue source for district?
It is district by district, how they generate local income. They don't have any taxing authority. They don't have a fee structure for any kind of rates or charges that they can apply. So it's basically whether or not we're kind of old traditional here, where it's been equipment rental, grass seed sales, those different sorts of things that they've generated their income out of. And so that is part of our challenge, in that we've got 86 conservation districts, some of which have no ability to generate local funds in that traditional manner.
So in Ohio, you gave us, Dorothy, a robust presentation on that, and the one-to-one match is just intriguing, and you told us about local funding sources. Any of those that include sales or any kind of taxes or assessment authority or any of that?
Well, districts, with the permission of the county commissioners, can put levies on the ballot. A few years back, we had a couple that were successful. However, on the renewal, they were not so successful. We do have one here recently, Williams County, that was able to pass a successful levy, so they'll be generating their local funds that way. The problem we're seeing with the levy, as enticing as that is that, you know, the way some of the school funding has been restructured in Ohio, we're finding that, you know, districts are up against, you know, a lot of local issues, especially school levies, and they're just not being successful. And another interesting fact we found out with levies is, you know, as far as all the work that we're doing outside of the incorporated areas, actually when those levies do pass, they're passed in town. If there's any, you know, the places where they may be spending time in schools and things like that. So it was very eye-opening. That's the only authority we have.
In Washington State, of course, I mentioned the Special Assessment Authority and rates and charges. Only 17 or 18 of our districts of 45 have used that authority to generate locally generated funding for conservation work. But they also, when I showed you that leveraging, they're also one of the districts that really have developed a great capacity, great leveraging, multiple conservation funding sources from not only the state but also federal and private sources, usually are generated from that smaller tax or smaller ability. We don't have taxing authority, but we've got special assessment authority and rates and charges. And if you want more information on that, I can sure supply that to you. Very, very interesting history behind all of that we've had. So I'm looking now if you've got any final questions of the panelists. Dorothy and Lisa, did you have questions for each other?
Ray, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Dorothy. How do you obtain the leveraging information?
We generate that with the State Department or the State Auditor's Department. The districts file their annual financial reports directly with our State Auditor's Department, and we can get the schedules from those, and they're all coded, so the State Auditor shop can supply that that information to us.
Okay, thanks.
You betcha. Any other questions there? All right. Well, folks, what a day it's been, and such an enjoyable time to take on a topic like state conservation funding systems. And just to let you know, we could have probably went out to several other states, I know we could have, and received information from each of them also on their state conservation funding systems. There are some very good examples out across the nation, and Mike, Aaron, or I could supply any of you with additional information about other state conservation funding systems. So we're hoping that you'll join us for any additional webinars, and that you'll go to our website, nascanet.org, for more information, the recordings, and then we'll also post the presentations up there also. So Mike, I get turned over to you, and I hope you're still on the line with us.
Ray, thanks so much. You're right on time as usual. Done a fantastic job. We appreciate you lining up speakers and hosting this webinar for us today. I also want to thank our presenters. They did a fantastic job. And again, it's a topic that everybody's interested in, and I think folks have shared some points that will be useful not only to those states but to everyone who participated today. I'd like to thank all of our NASCA members and our board of directors for giving us the ability to bring these webinars to you. And finally, I'd like to thank the Washington State Conservation Commission. Their technology, they share their technology with us to allow us to bring you these webinars. So thanks to all those folks, and unless anyone has anything further, Ray, we'll call this a wrap, another successful webinar, and thanks for your participation.
Very good, Mike, and thanks. I'll add my thanks to that. We'll close the webinar right now. Take care, folks.